So, just a brief little discussion about what we talked about last time. We're getting into kind of on the road to revolution, the American Revolution, that is. So we have to go from being 13 disunited, separate colonies to being 13 United States. Okay, so there's a lot of things that have to happen in order for this to go down, and a lot of it has to do with money. Okay, after a long, hard-fought, expensive war, what war? The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. The British found themselves, even though they were victorious, they found themselves having one of the biggest debts in the world. Even though they had the biggest empire, they also had one of the biggest debts. Some 140 million pounds. Now, I'm not talking about weight. Like they don't have dollars. They use British pounds, okay? About half of the debt that the British had from the war was incurred or happened in the colonies, in the American colonies. So enter this man, George Grenville, and he was going to begin to enforce like the Navigation Acts that were put into place in the 1600s, and he's doing it like like 110 years later. He's going to start enforcing those acts. All right, so he also passes through Parliament, the lawmaking body of the British government, the Sugar Act, which is the first ever law that was, and the first ever tax that was passed in order to tax the colonies, and that money to go straight to the British Crown to pay off the war debt. Okay, so, and it was obviously an increase, a tax on sugar. All right, which people like sugar then, just like they like it today. Okay, so there's other acts. We talked about the Quartering Act, allows British soldiers to be kept in a colonist home and given food, given a place to sleep, shelter. And then probably the worst up to this point was the Stamp Tax, or the Stamp Act, in 1765. Passed the same year as the Quartering Act. And, stamps, people had to pay a tax for these stamps. You had to put a stamp on any kind of paper product certifying that tax had been paid. So pamphlets, newspapers, Bibles, anything printed on paper, marriage licenses, everything, playing cards. So Americans are becoming more and more agitated and upset over these increasingly annoying taxes, okay? Especially since the tax money, the revenue that's being generated, is not being spent on them. It was money it's being sent back to the British Crown to pay a debt that was incurred for them, but they're no longer seeing any direct benefit from this tax money that they're paying. So, from the British perspective, from Grenville, the Prime Minister of the British government's perspective, he's simply asking Americans to pay their fair share, of the cost of their own defense. Can you kind of see it from his perspective? Can you guys see it from his? Yeah. So he's putting a little pinch on their pocketbooks, but Americans, they don't like that very much. They feel as though they're having their local liberties stricken upon. All right. So Grenville's legislation seemed to jeopardize the basic rights of the colonists, in the colonists' opinion. So this is just these are just some of the things that happened to begin to make the colonists a little bit angry. Not like to the point where they weren't ready to kill anybody. They're just angry. Okay, they don't like it. They're disgruntled, paying taxes. All right. So many Americans began to bind together, come together into groups. Okay, and these groups of people who they would meet, they would have meetings. They even created slogans. No taxation without representation. Have you ever heard that?
No.
What does that mean? What does it mean?
Not to
Sydney?
tax- I don't know.
Oh, I thought you had your hand. I'm sorry.
I've heard of that. I don't know.
Okay, you've heard it. That's cool. What's it mean?
Not to tax them because they didn't have anybody representing them in Parliament.
That's exactly right. So they're paying all these taxes, and the British government, Parliament, is imposing the taxes on them. So the people making the taxes, the laws, they're just saying, okay, you guys now have to pay this tax. Well, there's not any colonists that are a part of the British Parliament. Nobody. There's no colonists in Great Britain sitting on that body. And so they're making laws and taxing them, and yet the colonists have no seat at the table. They don't have anyone representing them. Taxation without representation. And they say no to that. No taxation without representation. We want to have a seat at the, we want to have representation. We want to have somebody speaking on our behalf. Okay? So, the only real power any colonists have were in their own local legislatures, but they tax themselves occasionally from time to time. But whenever these protests were heard by the British government, by the King, by George Grenville, what do you think they said to because it is true that the colonists were being taxed and not being represented. That is a 100% fact. How does George Grenville respond to this accusation? Okay, that he definitely thinks that for certain. What about in terms of representation? You're exactly right, Gracie. All right, so he just kind of dismisses it. He says it's absurd that.
Have your attention, please. Sorry for the interruption. I need Louis Padilla to report to the main office. Louis Padilla, report to the main office. Thank you.
Grenville dismissed the American protests as absurd, and he asserted that, of course, Parliament has the power to tax. Because even though the colonists do not have direct representation, they have virtual representation. So that word virtual doesn't just apply to like you guys going to school last year. How are you getting all this? Are you getting your text on? What are you doing? All right. Focus. All right, so Grenville's like, look, of course you're not real British subjects or real British people, but you are part of the British Empire, and so therefore Parliament virtually represents you. We have your best interests at heart, even though you have no representation. How do you think Americans took that? Doesn't that just sound like a bunch of baloney? That's what Americans said too. What a bunch of baloney. They probably said it in a lot harsher words though, using some profanity. Okay? So, yeah, we'll just say that Americans scoffed at the notion of virtual representation. So, the principle of no taxation without representation was supremely important. And the colonists clung to it with tenacity and consistency. And the British forced the Americans to deny the authority of Parliament and begin to consider their own political independence. So people are like, if we're going to pay these taxes, we might as well have the money for ourselves. And that is like a seed that gets planted in people's minds. Now, it doesn't grow into a mighty oak tree overnight. It takes a long time to go from an acorn to an oak tree. Just like the idea of independence. It takes a while. Even up until 1775, the year before we wrote the Declaration of Independence, most Americans were still like, God save the king, and toasting to his health. Even just 1 year. So it takes a while, okay? It takes a while. So, but we got to get the ball rolling, okay? And a meeting is called. Now, do you remember a meeting that tried to happen before the French and Indian War? The Albany Congress. And how did that go? Nobody showed up, like 7 out of 13. So they're going to try to have another meeting. And this meeting is going to be called the Stamp Act Congress. It's called the Stamp Act Congress. At the Stamp Act Congress, this was held in 1765, and delegates, it happened in New York City, by the way, and delegates from 9 colonies were there. So 9 out of 13, that's a majority, it's pretty good. And at this Stamp Act Congress, the members drew up a statement of their rights and grievances.
Wait, what'd they do?
They drew up, they wrote a letter, basically. And in this letter, it is a statement of their rights, the things that they believe that they have, and grievances, their complaints, things that they are upset about. And they addressed it to the British government, the King and Parliament.
The British government, is that who they addressed
The King and Parliament. Mm-hmm. Okay. You're the King of England, and you receive a letter from 9 of your 13 colonists with a bunch of complaints. How do you receive this letter? Basically, like toilet paper. You don't even pay attention to it. It is ignored. And the British government largely, on both sides, the Parliament and the King, largely ignore this letter. So nothing really happens as a result of this Stamp Act Congress as far as government goes. So why are we even talking about it?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So the other ones that didn't show up, like the 6 that didn't show up, wait, no.
4.
4.
Uh-huh. That's okay.
Did they not agree with writing a letter and sending it to the king, or were they just
Some of them did not agree with that. Some of them didn't feel like the taxes were that bad. Some of them didn't want to upset the British government. Some of them were just loyal to the king no matter what, and they weren't gonna. They were just taking. And then so, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know. I'm pretty sure Rhode Island didn't, and North Carolina. I know those 2. Okay. All right. Look, so why are we talking about it? If nothing really happened as a result, like they just ignored the letter. The letter's not what's important. So what's important about this? How about just the fact that there was a meeting?
And the colonies are trying.
That's right. They're working together. This leads to unity. Unity. United States. Unity. Okay? So it's bringing together these people. There was 27 delegates there. These 27 delegates are really the same people that are going to be helping to draft the Declaration of Independence and creating the Articles of Confederation, the future of America. So it helps to erode some of those sectional suspicions, like the distrust between colony. Like they're getting to know people. Okay? That helps. That's good. All right? So and even way more important than the letter that was drafted, this Stamp Act Congress adopted non-importation agreements. You guys know what non-importation agreements are? There's a simple word for it. Boycott. You guys know what a boycott is? What if we were gonna boycott Walmart? What does that mean? We're not going to shop there anymore, and we're going to take action to prevent others from shopping there. Okay? That is what these non-importation agreements are. So what are they going to boycott?
getting imports
From?
the British?
That's right. No more British goods. We're not buying it anymore. Where are we going to buy it from?
Other places.
Yeah. Is this a highly illegal at the time? What's it in violation of?
The navigation.
Navigation Acts. We're going to buy from somebody else. You know who's loving it? France. France and England have always hated each other. I bet they secretly hate each other today. But France and England were definitely rivals, and France was loving it. So, these non-importation agreements were a very promising stride towards union because they united the American people for the first time in a common action. In a common action.
When did you say these were, like, made? Like, what year?
1765, at the Stamp Act Congress, they decided to do this.
In New York.
That's where the meeting was held. That's correct. So mobilizing in support, get going and doing these boycotts, gave ordinary American men and women new opportunities to participate in the colonial government. Everybody can participate. You get a feeling of public defiance. Like by not purchasing British goods, you are doing your part to help your neighbors. And not just your direct neighbors, but neighbors, 500 miles away in a completely different colony. So, this feeling of helping out and participating in these non-importation agreements in a boycott, it unites people for the first time in a common action and spreads revolutionary ideas. It spreads this revolutionary fervor throughout the American colonial society. Now, was all this done in peace? Was this all peaceful? Hey, we're just not buying stuff, dude. We're just going to chill? No. Violence sometimes accompanied these protests. And groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, you ever heard of them? Sons of Liberty? Are directly responsible. They took the law into their own hands. All right, so this is a pretty famous artist's portrait rendition on the right here. And what's going on in this picture?
They're hurting people.
Yeah, who are they hurting?
The people for the
Okay, there's a couple different interpretations of it. One is that is the man that's the tax collector. He works for the British government, and they could be doing that to him. Another is just a person who buys British goods, who doesn't abide by the importation agreement. Well, all right. So what has happened to this gentleman here? That's okay. He's not dead.
Got tarred and feathered.
Yeah. You guys know what tarring and feathering is? Okay, it is it sounds like it doesn't sound so bad. Like they pour tar on you and then they throw feathers on you. Okay, and you look like a big chicken. But in order to get tar on you, you have to heat it. It's super hot. Okay, super, super hot. Otherwise, it's like solid. So it has to be heated. So if you've ever had hot wax poured on, it will blister you. Okay, so these people were horribly burned and then had feathers all over them. How you get it off? You don't. You got to heat it up again.
Are the other men hurting him as well?
Yes. What are they pouring down his throat?
Or I'm guessing.
Tea.
Oh.
You like British tea?
No.
We're gonna make you drink 5 gallons of it. Okay? This was very violent.
Does no one stop him?
Who's gonna stop them?
Yeah, there's a little thing, you have a little rope right there.
Yeah.
How about to hang him?
That was more for fear.
Oh.
That's what's next. That's the next step if you keep buying these British goods. Now this right here is pretty bad as it is. This is something that this person's going to take a long time to recover from. However, when they are seen in town and their body's scarred, not even still feathers stuck to them, is that not a reminder to other citizens? I better not buy any British tea today. It is. It is. So it's the threat of violence and the use of violence. Kind of, for a while, guys, it was kind of like mob rule.
So the Sons of Liberty were the people who did this, the people who fought for this stuff?
Yes. And also people who were worked for the British government. Yeah.
So
Dangerous guys. Okay, dangerous guys. So, they would do this. They'd do stuff like that. They would ransack the houses. Wait till of an unpopular tax collector, go in their home and just trash it while they weren't there. Kind of like thugs, okay? So pretty soon, nobody in some of the colonies were willing to sell the stamps anymore. Like, I'm not selling these stamps. I don't want to get my family tarred and feathered, my house destroyed. I don't want to do that. And so, if no one's willing to sell the stamps, is the Stamp Act really in effect? No. So, the machinery for collecting the stamp tax began to break down as many stamp agents began to resign, and there was no one to sell the stamps. So, therefore, the law was defeated, ultimately, really. Not to mention, England was hit particularly hard by Americans no longer purchasing their goods. Like, the American colonies were about 50% of all British exports. And that gets cut really in half during this time of the non-importation agreements. All right? So many merchants and manufacturers and shippers, they were suffering. You know, these British merchants, manufacturers, shippers, they were suffering. And they were protesting in England. They were upset about, hey, what are you doing over there, these colonists? You're hurting my business. Like, I'm suffering as a result of your laws. And so it was really British citizens converging in Parliament and protesting that gets the Stamp Act repealed. So the Stamp Act gets repealed. It goes away. But as soon as the Stamp Act is repealed in 1766, they replace it with something else. They replace it with what's called the Declaratory Act. 1766. After Parliament, really not wanting to, but they do, they repeal the Stamp Act.
Doesn't that mean take away?
It does. They repeal it. They take it away. They replace it with the Declaratory Act. Now, what the Declaratory Act does is it reaffirms Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That's the actual words. I'm going to explain what that means. Declaratory Acts in 1766. And what it does is it reaffirms Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So basically it means whatever Parliament wants to do in the colonies, they can, and the colonists have no say in the matter. That's what it means. Now, when news reaches the colonies of what's going on in Parliament, all the people really hear is, hey, no more Stamp Act. We win. Yay. The Declaratory Act was not a new act. It's not a new tax or anything, so it was largely ignored. They didn't even pay attention to it. But ultimately, because of this Declaratory Act, Parliament can do anything they want now. They can do anything they want to the colonies. Okay, so in 1766, no more Stamp Act, Declaratory Act put in. Enter this man. His name is Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend. He's a British guy. He became like the prime minister. His nickname's Champagne Charlie. Champagne Charlie. You know why they call him Champagne Charlie? Because he could deliver brilliantly spoken speeches with eloquent language while hammered drunk. And he often was. Champagne Charlie. And in the year 1767, Charlie Townshend convinces Parliament to pass the Townshend Acts, named after him, in 1767.
What does he do in 17?
He convinces Parliament to pass the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts are a very light tax on the following products. The Townshend Acts are a very light tax on the following products: glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. All manufactured goods. Okay, so Townshend made this tax. It's not like the Stamp Act. Okay, glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. All things that are manufactured or cannot be acquired in the colonies on their own. Got to get them from somewhere else. All right. So Townshend made this tax. It's different than the Stamp Act. How did the Stamp Act work?
Every paper good was.
That's right. You buy the stamps, and then you pay for the stamp, and it has to be put on the product. Okay, it's direct. Like the citizens are responsible for it. These taxes are indirect. They're indirect. These taxes are paid on the shore. When those products come from the boat to the shore, taxes must be paid. So does the average everyday citizen pay these taxes? Who's one's really responsible for paying these taxes?
The ones that sell it.
That's right. The manufacturer and the person, the merchants. However, if they have to pay more for these products, what are they going to do? Charge more. Okay? So it's a little less. You don't notice it as much. You don't notice it as much because you don't actually have to go and buy the stamps and do. You just say, well, it's a couple cents more this time. I want to have glass. I got to have these things. So it's indirect. Okay. Now he does this on purpose so that he's still taxing the colonists. They're just the colonists are not as aware of it. Okay. So it's a pretty slick move by Champagne Charlie. But how do you think the Sons of Liberty feel about this? Is this still taxation without representation? It is. Now, as far as all those things that get taxed, the glass, the lead, the paper, the paint, the one that was the most irksome was the tax on tea. The tax on tea. Okay? It was, I would say that an estimated 1 million people drank tea twice a day in the colonies. That's a lot of tea. Okay? A lot of tea. And the colonists were already kind of feeling in a rebellious mood. So the purpose of these Townshend Acts were to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in America. So it's not these taxes weren't even going back to the crown. They were paying judges in the New World. Okay? But Americans did not care. They didn't care how this money was being spent. They didn't want to be taxed at all. So, a lot Americans, like the Sons of Liberty, greeted these taxes with, disdain. They didn't like them. So, in response, non-importation agreements were quickly revived against the Townshend Acts. Listen here, folks. You don't buy any glass, lead, paper, paint, or tea. No more. You don't buy it anymore. And the Sons of Liberty strictly enforced this. But this one was a lot harder to enforce. Because the taxes were so light. They were so light. Guys, we pay more taxes than the colonists ever even dreamed about paying. By 100 times. These taxes are nothing. We pay for tax. Like, you guys go to the store and buy something, you're getting taxed 6% sales tax. They didn't even have that. Okay, it's like if you go to some place and it's $1, and you go to the cashier and you give them $1, is that enough? No, it's like $1.06 or $1.05. So they didn't have, this was nothing. This was like pennies. Okay, so the Sons of Liberty and the ones trying to enforce the boycott, the non-importation agreements, had a pretty tough time because the colonists took these taxes less seriously. And, the tax was so light and indirect. And if they were going to buy their tea from someplace else, like France, or maybe even a smuggler, the British tea that was being taxed was cheaper. It was cheaper than other tea because the British had so much of it, and you have a whole bunch of a product, the price of it is less. Now, I don't care how proud you are to be an American. Money talks in America. And if you can get the same product cheaper, are you not going to buy the cheaper product? Yes. And most Americans did. They're going to buy the British tea. It's cheaper. And they need it. They drink it twice a day. So, the Sons of Liberty are having a tough time, and so they have to make a brash move. Third period, second period. All right. So they have to make a brash move, and they're already mad. We're being taxed without being represented. All these British soldiers are still in the colonies, particularly in Boston. They're not, and they're trying to enforce these navigation acts, and it's just the stage is set for problems. And one major problem happens. This is a etching that's done by a guy named Paul Revere. You ever heard of him? Paul Revere made this, okay? And what event is this depicting? You probably have heard of it. The Boston Massacre, okay? This happened on March the 5th, 1770. March 5th, 1770. Boston was a city that was probably the most revolutionary because Boston was the one that was most affected by the British policies. Because Boston was a major shipping port. A lot of stuff came to Boston. Now, there was a whole lot of British soldiers in Boston. Why?
British stuff's getting imported out.
That's right. British stuff is being shipped here, and they want to enforce the Navigation Acts, and they want to enforce Champagne Charlie stuff, the Townshend Acts, making sure that tax is being paid as the goods are coming from the boat onto shore. It takes a lot of Boston is a big city, guys, and it's got a massive port, and it takes a lot of soldiers to do this. The only thing is these British soldiers are not being paid. They're not being paid because the British government, what act allows for the colonists requires the colonists to take care of the king's soldiers? The Quartering Act. So the king is basically abandoning these guys over here. You go do this job, work, and the colonists will feed you and make sure you got a place to stay. Well, that's all well and good, but they have no money in their pocket. So what are they going to do? How would you get money?
Rob, steal.
Get a job. Jeez, Gracie. Rob, steal. How about we get a job first? All right. So they get jobs. What's wrong with that? These are jobs that colonists want to have. It is creating extra competition for jobs in Boston. So not only are these British soldiers a pain in the neck because they're enforcing taxes, they're living in your house, and now they are taking your job. Is it any wonder the colonists hate them? All right. So, on March the 5th, 1770, it all came to a head. It all just kind of exploded in Boston. All right, so 2 regiments of a British detachment, 20 soldiers or so, were stationed outside the customs house, the place where all the taxes went down, protecting it, just standing on guard like they did every night. All right? And then
Like, where were they standing?
outside of a customs house, like a government building where taxes are collected. Okay? And a crowd of about 60 townspeople started to heckle them and jeer them. It's nighttime. I would say a lot of these townspeople were drunk. And then it's March in Boston. They started throwing snowballs. And then they started throwing rocks. And then they started throwing oyster shells. And then they started throwing horse poop, because it's everywhere. It's a city. And then some of them started throwing clubs. And, once some of these soldiers start getting hit in the face, in the eyes, they open fire for self-defense. If somebody's throwing a baseball bat at you and oyster shells at your face, do you have to put up with that? No. And these guys are holding guns. And so they open fire on these townspeople, okay? And there's about 10 guys that started shooting. And the actual first person to die is a guy named Crispus Attucks. He's a black guy living in Boston. He is to be considered the first casualty of the American Revolution.
What was his name?
Crispus,
Spell that.
Crispus, Crispus Attucks, Attucks. All right, so did British soldiers open fire on the townspeople? Yes, they did. They shot and killed people. They opened fire on the townspeople. Why did they open fire? They were under attack, basically. Not with people. They didn't have any guns, the townspeople, but they had other stuff. So, is this really a massacre? I mean,
Kill him or did they have like injured?
there's about 3 people died. Yeah, there were some dead people.
Wait, how many died? Did you say?
11 casualties in all. So wounded and dead, 11. But Crispus Attucks does die, and he's considered the first casualty. Okay? So is it really a massacre?
No.
Look at this picture. Look at what's going on. Like, what does this look like?
Very dramatic.
Like, hey, I'm gonna give you the order, ready, aim, fire. Like it was like battle. It didn't go down like that. It was like, oh my gosh, I just got hit in the face. And then people, like it was, and you got people like outnumbered. Like there's 60 here, and there's 10 British redcoats. 60 versus 10, and all 60 are throwing stuff at you. That's kind of how it went down, all right? So the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere's one of them, they take advantage of this, and he makes this print. It's actually an engraving, and then he is able to put it in a printing press and send it all throughout the colonies and spread the message that the British government are killing people. They are killing innocent people for no reason whatsoever. They have massacred your fellow colonists.
Who sent this out?
Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty. Okay? And we'll pick up more with this tomorrow.